What up, Matt Robinson with you on a brand new edition of the Tropicana Audio Podcast. We'll talk a little Blue Jays today, a little Leafs today with a guy who's got a pretty good handle on both from the Blue Jays Happy Hour podcast, the Maple Leaf Hot Stove podcast, writes for sportsnet.ca. Nick Ashbourne will join me here in just a moment. Give us a follow on social media at Tropicana Audio. Subscribe to the pod wherever you're hearing me right now. If this is your first time here, welcome aboard. And should mention that on the Friday morning edition of the podcast, our buddy Steve Bunda from 580 CFRA will be in studio for that one. Lots to ask him about. A guy who, works pretty tight around the CFL, and I'd be really curious to get his take on some of the rule changes, some of the schedule changes, certainly the playoff changes that are going to be implemented there. So we'll get into a lot of that with Bunda on Friday. Plus, everything kind of topical around the Stanley Cup playoffs. It's been a couple days since we've hit that. It's been a lot of Leaf news, right? Dominating the hockey world. You know Gary loves that, right? Gary loves when teams make news outside of the playoffs and distract away from that. So, this has no doubt been a fun week for him. We'll get Bunda's take on all of it on Friday, but no reason to waste a whole lot more time. Let's get right into it here. Our guest today from the Blue Jays Happy Hour podcast, from Sportsnet, from the Maple Leafs Hot Stove podcast, is Nick Ashbourne. And I asked, 20 people in the days leading up to this podcast whether or not he was a good guest to have on, and only one was supportive of the idea. 19 of them said things like con artist and liar and salesman, which felt like a weird drive-by on the poor salesman of the world. But he's here anyway, man. Defend yourself. How are you?
You know what? To be a good podcaster, some level of salesmanship and con artistry is probably part and parcel with that package. So I'll take it. Also, 5% approval rating is better than some people get.
It's true. Some people in politics right now would probably be envious of that level, but we'll leave that for another day. Look, it's been a wild week on the Leaf front, but I am based here in the nation's capital, and I promised the good listener, because they've already heard some of my opinions on some of the goings-on around the Leafs here a little bit, that I would start with the Jays and allow things to be broken up a little bit. I'm sort of curious, man. It felt leading into that Minnesota series like the dig-out was happening, right? The Blue Jays had battled a pile of injuries, some weird stuff at the beginning, and they'd put themselves behind the 8 ball. But then they go and they win 3 series in a row. And it doesn't happen immediately, right? You were never going to get out of the hole you dug immediately, but that's what it was going to look like. It was win 3 series in a row. It was probably split a road series with the Twins and just peck away at it. And then, of course, we have to make our return to the Trop, which has always been a house of horrors for Blue Jays and their fans. Just in a general sense, before we kind of dive in here a little bit, what have you made of the first month and a bit of this Blue Jays season? And how bad, I should, I suppose, point out for the listener, it is about 1 o'clock on Wednesday as you and I are speaking, so we don't know how that final game at the Trop is going. I have my suspicions how it's going to play out in the end, but that's just damaged Blue Jay fan mentality. Where are the Jays at this point for you?
It's indisputably disappointing, right? Like, this is far worse than they thought they would be. I'm not sure people assume they would be, say 25-11, which is what the Yankees are leading the division with as we record. I don't think that's the type of start that was projected, but it also wasn't a particularly difficult schedule. They're just starting to get into the AL East now. Mm-hmm. They haven't dealt with the Yankees. They haven't dealt with some of the better teams on the other side in the NL as well, although they've seen the Dodgers. It wasn't super daunting, especially right out of the gate. And so there was a missed opportunity, and now, as you said, they're kind of in dig-out mode. Some of the issues are pretty attributable to just injuries, right? Like, that is part of it. They've had a disproportionate amount of injuries to important players, to, the Alejandro Kirks and the George Springers of the world and Addison Barger. And somehow, even though they had this rotation with so many viable options heading into the season, they still found themselves short on that. Now, that doesn't mean that they're necessarily happy with some of the performances they've gotten with the fill-in players. But if I'm being optimistic about the Jays, I'd say look at sort of the top of the roster, the starters that they were counting on to be in the rotation, Gosman and Cease. Look at the guys at the back end of the bullpen, and I know that Tyler Rogers is coming off a tough one, but sort of a tough one in the shape of what bad ones look like for him.
Sure.
Look at Vladdy. I know there's some disappointment there with the power, but the overall production is pretty good. A lot of these players are playing well. I mean, even Okamoto has now come around and has been a major contributor on offense. The best
I heard on
guys,
April 12th he sucked, though.
yeah, I mean, baseball requires a level of patience that not everyone is up for, is what I'd say about that. So like, a lot of the best players on this team have been really good. And last year, what you had was so many guys across the roster, even in more minimal roles, stepped in and gave you a lot. And it just raised the floor of the team. That hasn't quite been the same. Teams coming back, no one in the American League is running away with these wildcard spots. And I'm not saying the team can't win the division because it's early in the season, but at 9 games back and the Yankees looking very, very good, that's really unlikely at this point. That's just the reality. So if you think about the wildcard situation and that being the most realistic goal from here on out, they're still very much in it. They're getting healthier. A lot of the players are playing better. It's unfortunate where they're at, and it's not where they'd want to be, but it's not a lost season yet or anything like that. It's not as grim as it could be for being under 500.
You sort of referenced the rotation specifically there, and look, it is getting healthier, or to some degree, like we're hearing progress on Bieber, but we're not sure exactly how close he is. It's been nice to see Yasavage return to the rotation, but Jose Barrios appeared to be the one closest after Yasavage to coming back, and the last couple of outings in the minors, I do my best to not read into the line, right? And how things actually play out. He might just be working on things at spring training still for him. And yet you can't help but notice the velo. And obviously the team has now indicated that they're concerned as well. I'm sort of curious for you because, like you said, when they're signing Max Scherzer just before spring training or as spring training opens, it's sort of like, do we really need an 8th starter? And it turns out, yes, we do. And now he's not healthy either. And you've had to reach out to Patrick Corbin and these sorts of things. Are you concerned? Like, what's your level of optimism that Bieber is going to come back at all? That Barrios is going to come back? Like, are we, is it going to be a whole year of this version of Lauer and things like? I'm just sort of curious your level of optimism or concern around this rotation.
Bieber is a really interesting hinge point because I think a return from him would go such a long way to improving the rotation, even if he's more the guy we saw last year and not necessarily the best version of Shane Bieber of all time. Mm-hmm. Because then you're looking at Gosman, Cease, Savage, Bieber, and then you're figuring one spot out. We just don't really know at this point. There's not a lot of information on just how far along he is, what the team expects from him. So that one is tough to say, but at the same time, crucially important, which is not a situation you want to be in. And then Barrios is very much a troubling situation, right? Like, as you mentioned, the team has demonstrated their concern. This is not a situation where the team has said, I got roughed up in Buffalo, but it was cold out there and, he's bored. He doesn't really want to be there throwing to minor league hitters, and we just wanted to see him get his stuff, and we track the stuff, and it's good. With Yasavage, his results were not good in his rehab starts, and I'm not saying that he's been a world beater since he came back, but he came back and in his first outing kind of delivered right away a quality start for the team. I don't think the Blue Jays see Barrios as doing that, and now they potentially are going to get more information about where he's at physically. So Barrios was always a bit of a performance risk based on what happened at the end of last season, and now there are health question marks, and it doesn't seem like he's particularly close to solving any problems for the big league squad.
And he's got, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, at the end of this season, a player option or 2 player options for the next 2 years. Look, if this is what he's got left in the tank, he's obviously not opting out. Like, it would be really not smart for him. Where is the team? Like, do you just sort of have to risk buying him out? Or, like, I can't imagine they're going to put him in the rotation here.
The thing with Barrios to remember, I guess, is that he's still, I don't want to say young, but he hasn't turned 32 yet. So There is a world where this is an odd injury bump in his career and he's able to work his way back. Will the Jays be delighted when he opts into his contract after 2026, which, as you referenced, he will almost certainly do? No, I think they would rather he walked away from that money and they're able to apply it elsewhere. But because he'll be in the organization, there will be efforts to get him back to where he needs to be physically and kind of assess from there. It's fair to lower expectations at this point and maybe even consider what you get from him a bonus, but I'm not sure it's time to give up on the concept of Jose Barrios being useful to the Blue Jays at some point in 2026, 2027, or 2028. It's just looking less and less like it's going to happen in the near future.
Yeah, because he is pitching through, and everyone kind of seemed confused that it was a fracture in his elbow or something like that, and everyone was like, well, he can pitch through it. And that seemed crazy, but what the hell do I know? Like, I'm not a medical expert at all or a pitching expert at all, so you just kind of, oh, well, if they think he can pitch through it, he can pitch through it. Maybe it just means this is another kind of lost season while he goes and heals up, and then he opts in and maybe can still return as a fifth starter. Have I got that right? Is it a fracture? Is that what we heard?
I believe so. And you and I are on the same page. When I heard that he was going to attempt to pitch through that sounded like an insane proposition to me. We all know that the act of pitching itself is a violent act on someone's arm. I'm not sure you want to add a fracture in the elbow to the equation, but I was ready to defer to the experts on that. And so far, I don't know, any optimism that was expressed at the time doesn't look as prudent as it might have seemed it when this injury first came to light.
It's true. Talk to me about Vladdy a little bit, because, we did make mention of him here a moment ago, and his numbers, for the most part, are all good, except for the power. And that has been a bit of a frustration point throughout his career at different times. But he is delivering. He is hitting. There's always been talk about his swing path, and that's why he doesn't get it up into the air quite as much. But we've also seen that when the playoffs roll around, and almost like a flick of the switch, yeah, he's got power. Like, he was incredible during the playoffs last year. What do you make of the start that he's off to, and why it's kind of playing out in the way that it is?
It's interesting because he does seem to go through a stretch something like what we're seeing now in essentially every season. This one is starting to get a little bit long in the tooth, though. Like 2-3 weeks into the season, I might have said, this is just nothing. This is a blip. He has this happen. As you mentioned, he's got that flat swing plane. He's got the low launch angle. You kind of just accept that that's part of the deal, and sometimes the power won't be there the way you want. And people want him to be this 40-plus home run hitter. I'm not sure he's that guy long term. Someone I've often compared him to is Miguel Cabrera, who had more kind of home run totals in the 30s, but the very high average and on base. And maybe that's more the type of player he can be over the course of his career, kind of similar to what he was in 2024, for instance, as opposed to 2021. That maybe feels like more his skill set. The other day when I was looking at his numbers, I was thinking, like, maybe he's even Edgar Martinez. And then, he'd have to do better than he's doing now to be Edgar Martinez. But maybe it's more like home runs in the low 20s and OBPs well over 400. Maybe that's the way it's going to happen for him. Maybe it's more so this season. The power will be better than this. Like, it will come along. He's not going to finish the season with, 10 home runs or something if he's healthy. But as I said before, this stretch is getting a little bit uncomfortably long. It's not feeling quite the same as some of the other ones he's had in his career. There's also just a little bit of frustration with him too. Like, he's not like he's striking out a ton, but he's striking out a bit more lately, and you're seeing it with him. It does seem from the outside, and I don't have access to his inner thoughts, but it does seem like there's some level of frustration creeping in, and maybe it just takes 1 or 2 swings to get this thing back on track. It probably does, but you would like these stretches of his seasons to last 2-3 weeks as opposed to a month plus.
Sure. I'm just, final thing on the Jays here, because they're just in an interesting spot. Like I said, after winning 3 series in a row and splitting with Minnesota and everything, and now it's Tampa, as I alluded to, and these sorts of things happen. I'm not ready to panic, but it does sort of feel like you've undone a couple of weeks worth of good work here in one series. We'll see what happens on Wednesday. But Dylan Cease, and I think to a certain degree, a lot of what we've seen out of him so far looks almost exactly like what we were told to expect, that the stuff is incredible. And, he can really obviously throw the hell out of the ball, but sometimes he's not going to go as deep as you'd like him to. I'm sort of curious for you, as we've watched the first month and a half here now of Dylan Cease, does it feel that way to you? Like this has sort of been the book on him and we're getting what we should expect, or are the things that you would expect to kind of change as the season plays out? I believe he and Gausman there to start the season set some sort of record for strikeouts in the first 2 starts of any team's season. So we know he has that in him, but sometimes he can get a little wild and doesn't go all that deep into games. Is that just sort of, what we should expect the rest of the way here?
Mainly, it is funny because as good as Dylan Cease is, he can be a bit of a tough watch at times. Like you look up and he's got the ERA that's just over 3, and in quite a few of his outings, he hasn't felt like that type of pitcher because the wildness has crept in, the walks have come up. As you mentioned, he hasn't gone deep into games. He's consistently going deep into counts. It is sort of a feature with him. He's going to get a ton of strikeouts. He's going to walk more people than average. There are some developments with him, right? Like he's got a bit of a new look changeup. He's using it more. He's a little bit more diversified in his pitches overall. Like last year, he really hammered fastball slider, and that's still his bread and butter, but he's working the changeup more. He's working the curveball against left-handed hitters. The Blue Jays are clearly looking at some things with him. The velocity is good with him, and the contact against is a little bit more encouraging this season. So, like, there's things you can point to around the edges of, okay, Cease is doing some work, he's tinkering, the Blue Jays have some ideas. But at the end of the day, the big picture of this is a high pitch count, high strikeout, high walk guy who's not necessarily going to give you 200 innings, I'm not sure that is suddenly going to change. I don't think he's suddenly going to be, a big sinker baller who's ending at bats in 2 or 3 pitches. Like, this should work for the Jays relatively well, in part because the bullpen has been good. And so when he gives you, 5.2 innings or something like that, you feel okay turning it over to the guys that they have. But it's a feature to keep in mind when team building. The same way you'd keep in mind, you don't bring Tyler Rogers over to the team who's going to get you a million ground balls if you feel like you have terrible infield defense. Sure. Like that's a bad match. Dylan Cease's, I think it's fair to say, inability to consistently go deep into games has an impact on the bullpen. And if the team has a terrible bullpen, that will make Cease's impact lessen to some degree. And right now the team's bullpen is good. So you don't mind it so much as long as the rest of the rotation is okay and not constantly taxing the bullpen. And that's a bit of a different issue, but that's more injury related than team construction related.
I know I said that was going to be the end on the Blue Jays. I do have one more because I've heard you and Stoughton talk about this a little bit on the Blue Jays Happy Hour podcast, which we will link to here in the show notes. Highly recommend. Where are we at with the back end of that bullpen? Because I feel like a lot of people in that a lot of the value that you get out of Louis Varland comes from his ability to enter a lot of different situations. And they said this is going to be a bit of a committee while Hoffman rebuilds his confidence and rebuilds his stuff here a little bit, but it hasn't been that much of a committee. It hasn't
been a committee at all.
No, so I would prefer to see him back in that role where you can drop that guy anywhere in a pinch and feel pretty good that you're going to get out of it. What's your confidence level that? Like, my confidence level that we will see Hoffman again as the closer this year is about just shy of 100%. What is your confidence level that we will see him there and that he will be effective in that role again? I'm going to throw you the extra wrinkle, give myself the easy one.
I'm fairly confident that Hoffman would be effective if given another opportunity. I'm not as confident he's going to go back in that role. And it's not necessarily because he's not going to earn it or he's not going to pitch well enough to justify using him like that. But they did say they wanted this committee, and that opens up a lot of different possibilities in terms of playing matchups, and it sort of frees the manager up.
Sure.
And then next thing you know, they're so insistent on having Varland in the ninth that they're pitching him the day after he throws 30 pitches, which is generally a no-no.
Right.
So the thing about closers is they're such a comfort
and we will have
item
Garcia
for a
returning
manager.
at some point as well, which will be a factor in this.
Pardon?
Garcia returning at some point will as well become a factor in some of this as we go.
Yeah, I'm a bit skeptical just because he's a little bit older and it's been a while since he's been that type of player. I just don't feel like I have a good handle on what we're going to see from Garcia. But with Varland, just for a manager, it's so nice to have this guy who's basically unhittable that you can throw out and end games with. Like, I'm sure that it just feels really good for Schneider to be in that position as opposed to juggling players. And right now he feels like he can end games with Varland. And as much as there's sabermetric discussions about should the closer role really exist and how do we deploy pitchers and should we focus more on what part of the lineup? And with Hoffman, they really have. Like, Hoffman has been used against the bottom of opposing teams' lineups pretty consistently as they're trying to bring his confidence back. As much as we have those conversations, at the end of the day, Moneyball was over 20 years ago, and it seems like managers still really like having that closer. So it feels like Varland might have to pitch his way out of it, even though I agree with you that it is very nice to have him in a more flexible role where he can get the team out of trouble.
Speaking of getting teams out of trouble, it's been a wild week for the Leafs. On Monday afternoon, Monday evening, things were in a pretty dark place after another not ideal press conference for MLSE, if I could put it charitably. And then Tuesday evening, all of a sudden, everyone was feeling quite a bit more charitable and, everything's going to be fine. We're looking up. Let's try and do this in pieces here, I suppose. I'm curious in a general sense about your take on, let's break down the pieces into even smaller pieces, I suppose. Mats Sundin and John Chayka. Let's start with John Chayka. I can't imagine that he was on, maybe I'm wrong, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, that he was on your radar when we started this search. I know we heard the name as it moved on and the process was playing out. Is there any level of optimism for you before we get the Gavin McKenna news, which has nothing to do with Mats Sundin or John Chayka, it's dumb luck, but that they make that hire? Are you, is there any part of you kind of turning over and going, all right, like I can see why maybe that's the guy and why they would be there. I could get on board with this. Or were you as sort of astounded as a lot of Steve Simmons contacts?
I don't think me and Steve Simmons contacts generally have that much in common. I don't totally agree with them. I understand why there's disbelief here, right? There's disbelief because you're talking about an executive who has not been in hockey for some time. When he was with Phoenix, did not have some immense level of success. Left on bad terms, broke rules. There is questions about this person's integrity. And when you have questions about someone's integrity, and then on the flip side of that, you don't have a massive resume to point to say, okay, listen, this guy might be a snake, but look what he's accomplished.
Sure.
With Chayka, it's like, this guy might be a snake.
He also stinks.
But also the Wendy's stuff was really successful. That's a bit of a cheap shot.
I do prefer Wendy's over Boston Pizza. Like, if we're going to have that conversation.
Wendy's makes a sneaky okay breakfast. I'll give them
okay. I haven't had the Wendy's breakfast.
A Wendy's breakfast. No, okay. Also, the Wendy's thing is a funny punchline, but if he'd done any other business, it would have been fun. You know what I mean? If he had gone into shipping, no one would make jokes, but 100%. They just think it's funny because it's Wendy's, which is what we just did, so fair enough. But no, but here's what I'll say. Here's what I think the vision is. And I'm not saying this is correct, but I also think that the opposite side of this has not been presented very well because people just hate Pelly, and
Right.
they don't have any faith in MLC, so they've jumped down the negative rabbit hole, which is, again, I think might well be right at the end of the day.
Sure.
But what Pelly probably saw is, I am looking for a forward-thinking, data-driven type general manager. It's hard to find one of those guys that has also done it before. So he doesn't have to go for sort of the old head conventional person, and he doesn't have to go for the assistant general manager that other people tell him is smart, but he doesn't really know what that person will do in this seat. In Chayka, you get someone who has both of those components. He's also grown up in this market, so he has a little bit of an understanding of what it means to be a Leaf, what the difficulties of this market are. I don't think that means he's going to be successful necessarily. I don't think that makes the questions about him invalid, but I'm not sure he's as insane of a candidate as he's being portrayed, because this is someone who, for his faults, was consistently thought of as kind of a smart, capable guy on the rise, had a rough time in a nasty place to try and be successful.
In a chaotic organization, yep.
And like I said, he has these characteristics. I think Pelly was hiring for characteristics rather than resume, and that's easy to criticize because, it's much easier to point to a resume saying this is what the person has done, they will do this again. And whether they can do it in Toronto compared to where they were before, that's always a question mark. But it's harder to sell people on the idea like, oh, this guy is a sharp person who thinks the way we want someone to think about team building, because that's so nebulous. And then you throw in these questions about his character and the fact that the resume is kind of dubious at best. Again, I'm doing a little bit of a devil's advocate here.
Sure.
I just want to put that forth because it seems like everything has been so negative and everything has been so much in the vein of how could they possibly do this? Whereas I think they may well be absolutely wrong to have done this, but I can at least somewhat see the logic behind pursuing him as a candidate.
Well, I think that's reasonable, right? And I've been guilty of it here. I don't care for Keith Pelly. Like I don't enjoy his press conferences. They do.
I don't think anyone does.
No, I'm not even sure he does. They do the opposite of put confidence in me that this organization is in the right hands. And look, we can draw all the other lines or conclusions that Chayka wouldn't have a ton of leverage or a ton of negotiating power, having sort of been persona non grata, and that would allow Pelly to keep his fingers in the pie, right? I can hire a guy who will let me remain engaged here in a way that maybe fans wouldn't like. But I do think it is important to acknowledge that a lot of the things that make me uncomfortable with this hire come from, while I do have reservations about John Chayka, my reservations, a significant part of it, come from not trusting the people who made the hire, and that's a very different conversation. So I'm highly skeptical that this works, but I think it's important to at least be aware of why that skepticism exists. It's not just John Chayka, who, maybe did learn some things. I complained loudly when the Leafs got rid of Kyle Dubas, and a big part of my complaint wasn't just that I thought he was better than the guy they replaced him with. It was, you let that guy learn on the job here and then go apply those lessons somewhere else. I suppose if I'm being reasonable, I have to allow for the fact that John Chayka learned on the job in Arizona and now won't make those mistakes in Toronto. If I'm being, reasonable, which is not a characteristic I always carry.
And I think he could have helped himself significantly if he had gone into that more in the press conference, right? Like Chayka did not portray himself as a humble person, thankful for the opportunity to return, who had learned a lot and was ready to apply those learnings. He made kind of vague references of, not being proud of every decision that he'd made in the past and having made mistakes and learning things. But if he had radiated any kind of humility, I think they might have done and some of it is the Pelly hatred, and so people just weren't going to be on board.
Well, and there were moments where Pelly was doing, like, putting his hand up and like, I'll handle this. Well, like, that does not instill confidence that you've hired somebody that you're about to give autonomy to. It comes across as dad saying, I'll take care of this. You sit there. And
I mean, Pelly could have easily introduced Sundin and Chayka and then left
the room.
That would have been valid.
Yep.
Or just sat there and not said anything.
Yep.
And then when he later went on to do his AI denial thing, even though that question wasn't asked, he just kind of looped it into a question of Ty Domi. Like, then he comes off as like, trust me, I have no specific love for Pelly, and I think that he's not good at communicating with this fan base at all. And that didn't help these guys. And like I said, if you put a gun to my head, am I excited about this front office team? No, I think that there's a variety of other outcomes that would have made me more excited. But it does feel like everyone in the market has this foregone conclusion that this is going to be a disaster, and I'm not sure we know that just yet.
Let's do the other half of it here, and this is the part that, if I'm being honest with you, worries me a little bit more, and that's the Mats Sundin factor, and it's because I grew up as one of those kids who loved Mats Sundin, like my favorite player, and we had Graham Nichols on the show from the Hockey News a week or so ago, and I asked him to sort of compare, at that time, the rumor that Sundin would be returning to the Leafs with when the Sens brought back Daniel Alfredsson. And it wasn't a great comparison. It was a bad question by me because at least the Sens had the foresight at the time to bring him back in. I guess the titles are similar, but it sure doesn't sound like the responsibilities are going to be similar. But it was bring him back in kind of an advisory role, and like you do with a lot of players, let them learn the front office thing. And yet here in Ottawa, we've seen what can happen. Like the Sens were brutal on the power play in their first round series against Carolina, and Alfie had moved down to the bench and he was running the power play, and all of a sudden people are pissed, and you're seeing fire Alfie stuff on Twitter that is damaging to his reputation. And no one will ever forget what he did for that franchise, but all of a sudden you're tangled up in this other mess that you didn't necessarily have to be. But as far as management goes, maybe the better comparison is Trevor Linden in Vancouver, who, again, was part of a terrible management group. And while people still love Trevor Linden, the player, I think it complicates the legacy just a little bit. And Mats Sundin is coming in. He has no management experience whatsoever. It sounds like he's being put into a situation where he will have at least some say or responsibility. And I'm a little worried for that guy, that his legacy is about to be tied up in a group that I don't have a whole lot of confidence in.
It is an interesting situation. You know, cards on the table. I'm someone who grew up at the time that, you know, Mats Sundin would have been someone I literally would have described as my hero when I was 10 years old. So it is hard to sift through this with an objective lens. Mm-hmm.
I'm thrilled he's back in the organization. I'm also terrified of it.
And so I have a lot of those same feelings. I think Sundin is in a weird situation where this is a guy who's 55 years old. He's been away from the game since 2009 when he retired. And so when you have someone at his level, you know, just kind of his age and stage, to be honest, he's kind of at a level where you don't really want to just bring him back in a small milquetoast role because, you know, he's moving from Sweden. He wants to do more than that. But at the same time, he's not qualified to do much more than that because he hasn't been around the game. He hasn't had any management experience. So if you'd given him the big role like president or something like that, that would have been very confusing. If you'd given him something smaller than this, and let's be honest, it's unclear what this is, and we'll probably learn more as the seasons go on, then maybe that would have been insulting to him or wouldn't have been enough to bring him back into the fold. But I feel like we haven't learned exactly what he's going to be. And when he spoke in a fairly guarded manner, and he didn't give much away, and he repeated a lot of his points if you listen to him on, you know, radio shows and things he did afterwards. Mm-hmm. A lot of what he spoke about was kind of the perspective of previous generations. And it almost sounded like he was the mayor of Alumni Town. And he was going to be the person who brought that experience of what went right and wrong. He said that phrase quite a lot from those times forward and applied it to this new generation, almost like it would include other alumni members. And that was a little bit unclear. It's just, I don't know how he's going to make an impact on the organization, so it's hard for me to be particularly critical. It's just money, presumably, that they're throwing at him. I don't know that there are positive outcomes he will prevent from happening in any way, shape, or form. I would just love to have a better sense of what he sees his contribution to the team being, because kind of outside of culture and outside of bringing knowledge from previous generations of the Leafs, it just wasn't clear from the first couple days here.
Well, and, success in Mats Sundin's world, as much as I love him, was a couple of conference finals, right? Like, we're not talking about a repeated champion or whatever else, but there was a different vibe around the team at the time. As we talk about role, one of the things that's out there and one of the things that scares me a little bit, and I don't know whether this is conscious or unconscious by the organization or by him, what are your thoughts on the idea that he will play human shield for, I don't know that Keith Pelly would, actually sit down and say, what I'm about to do is going to be bad and unpopular, so bring me a shield that people will love and not criticize as much. I doubt it's that overt, but there's a certain amount of, like I said, I fear that Mats Sundin is going to be tied to something that is a little bit negative or doesn't pan out, and that maybe he is kind of the guy that is supposed to soften the blow for MLSE.
I think that's valid. It would be totally naive to think that MLSE did this move totally divorced from advancing their position in a PR sense. Like that was clearly part of it. And I'm not saying Sundin doesn't have insight and good thoughts about hockey, and everyone will tell you that he's a smart individual. And there will likely be opinions he has on certain players, and maybe he will be very helpful to front office operations. Like I said, it's more of a situation of not knowing at this point.
Yeah.
But it would be foolish to say, oh, this is only about Sundin's competence and what Sundin is able to do and what he knows. There is an aspect of this in terms of selling the direction of the team.
Yeah, we're unpopular right now. We had a bad year and people aren't happy. Here you go. Here's Mats. You like that guy. Here's some nice feelings for you. Like, it's...
Yeah, and the way they talked about it, like, this has been in the works for some time in terms of what can Mats do in the organization and bringing him in. And it may be, again, I think Pelly referenced reading his book, which I thought was interesting because I read his book too, and there's not a lot in there, to be honest.
That's true.
Not in a super negative way. It's just kind of like it was a nice walk down memory lane for me reading the book, but it wasn't full of scorching insights on the Leafs organization and what they need to do better. So it was a weird thing to be referenced. It might be a situation where we just don't know the extent of Sundin's influence and impact for a long time, or maybe until after this whole chapter is done, because I'm not sure I see him speaking too much to the media. Chayka is going to be the go-to guy, and whoever the coach is generally interacts with the media more. It's a little bit mysterious, but as you mentioned, the PR thing is inescapably part of it. And to be honest, I think most people see through that. I don't think there are too many people who are saying, "Oh my God, I'm so happy with the situation because I heard Sundin's name and that's all I needed to hear." Like, you and I are just talking about how we grew up with Sundin in that era and have positive feelings towards it, and neither of us are saying, "Oh, as a result of Sundin being here, suddenly my excitement level is going through the roof."
There was a thing, though, that did occur on Tuesday evening that has changed the vibes and created at least a little bit of excitement, and it has certainly added to the roller coaster of this offseason. It's made everyone here in the nation's capital very excited and very happy, and no one's grumbling at all about the fact that the Toronto Maple Leafs have won the draft lottery. The ability to, the presumptive number one overall pick is Gavin McKenna, and assume that's what will happen. There are people, like I'm not a prospects guy. I know some names. I like watching the World Juniors, but I have no insight of any value about which prospect is better. We've already heard John Chayka talk about the fact that the team needs some puck-moving defenders. I don't know whether that would lead them to go with a Chase Reed or a Keaton Verhoff or one of these sorts of guys, but they have won the draft lottery. They have the first overall pick, and the mood seems to have almost changed on a dime. Is it as simple for you as go ahead and just pick the guy that you believe is the best player available? Do you draft for need? Would you think about trading the pick to do something more immediate to keep you competitive? It was quite the... I fully expected in my self-loathing Leaf brain that Florida would win the lottery, knock Toronto's pick down to Boston, like all the worst-case scenarios. It never crossed my mind they might finish at number one. What did it say to you in terms of, the future for the team, the fact that this happened on Tuesday night?
This is potentially a franchise-changing event, and I think there's so much thought put into would they be able to cling on to the top 5 spot. I'm not sure people really even let themselves believe that a lottery win
honestly
was a
never
possibility.
Crossed my mind, man.
Yeah, it's 8.5%, whatever it was. I think it was down under 5% after a couple of balls had gone. And, came down to the now famous 12 that will be remembered. It'll be remembered if the player is really good. Sure. If the player's not great, I don't know if it'll be remembered quite so much. It's interesting, and I'm going to be clear here, too. Like, I'm not a huge prospect film grinder, and to be honest, I think there are too many people that claim to be prospect experts. Being a hockey prospect expert is virtually impossible. You'd have to have knowledge of so many different leagues and levels, and the people who do that work, more power to them, but I also find that there's a lot of information about that, and it's hard to sift through. My kind of understanding is that McKenna and Stenberg are in a tier of their own, and you could make a case for either of those guys. It's a bit unfortunate for the Leafs that the year they win the lottery is the year where the two best players are wingers, when they could really use a foundational defenseman or even a center to go. To go after Matthews and in the post-Tavares era. So that's a bit unfortunate, but it's hard to be too upset about a lottery win. The idea of trading out is somewhat interesting to me, but I could see a case being made for trading slightly down. Like, let's say the Canucks were in love with McKenna and you wanted to trade down and then pick the top defenseman on your board after those wingers go, and you were able to get something out of that package. Maybe, but chances are you just sit there and you say, which of these guys is the special talent who might be good for us now and great for us later, and don't overcomplicate it. The Leafs aren't good enough, I think, to be honest, to draft for need. They should be drafting for talent.
Yes.
And you can't rule out a trade, but trading out of this spot is pretty unusual. Like I said, there's a case to be made for. I wouldn't be trading for a veteran player. I think the Leafs need foundational talent. It's so hard to find. A lot of people talked about how that was one of the reasons why the future seems so bleak for the Leafs. Is like, where is the next source of a foundational player for this team? They don't have first-round picks coming their way. They don't have elite prospects, and they don't have players on team maybe outside of Matthew Knies with trade value to help you get someone who is a possible core player. And you could argue Knies is a core player, and that might be a lateral move. So the Leafs have a chance to add a core player to this group, and that's a very exciting place to be, and not one that it seemed like they'd be based on how bare the cupboards were and what the status of the roster was.
Yeah, I think that was part of the negativity around, any hire that was coming in. It was like, okay, theoretical new president or GM, good luck to you, because we'd like to stay good, and we have nothing to trade to make that happen. You do now have one piece, whether you decide to trade that piece or does that open up an avenue for you to trade something else. One of the interesting wrinkles about this is the Austin Matthews situation, who, if he didn't think the organization was going to be on a good path, had the ability to say, yeah, I'd like to get out of here. It opens up a path there where, is he interested now in sticking around because your future looks a little brighter? Or could you go another path where you trade Matthews and the return for that and the potential return for Willie, if you started down that path, creates a new young core that maybe isn't immediately great, but suddenly has you in a very different position that you thought you were going to be in, with some picks and prospects coming in. I just think it opens up some options and some avenues and paths that didn't exist before. I guess part of that's going to depend on ownership and what they're insisting on right away. But I do think having a first overall pick, like you said, whether it be Stenberg or whether it be McKenna, allows you to do some things that perhaps weren't on the table before. And maybe now you have more paths than you did 48 hours ago.
Well, think about what the alternative is, right? The Leafs going into that draft lottery had just under 60% chance of giving, let's call it the 6th or 7th pick to the Boston Bruins. Yeah. And so in that universe, the Leafs don't have a first-round pick this season. Boston has a pretty good pick. Not that that's what matters the most, but I don't think Leafs fans like to see that.
Nope.
And then your thing to look forward to in the future is a pick in 2028, and you don't know where that pick is going to be. So there's a huge difference between having a first overall blue-chip talent and having to wait to 2028 for a mysterious pick that might or may not even be good. Like that has tilted the situation for the Toronto Maple Leafs in a pretty profound way.
Yeah, no, it could be a 13th overall pick in 2028, and it's just a reasonable prospect, and who knows. I am sort of curious, just before we wrap up here, what this means to you as we head into an offseason with a new management group, with whatever. Like, do you expect them to go hard at, whatever we're doing, the retool versus rebuild, trying to remain competitive? Like, the Matthews thing hangs over all of this, right? Like, it sounds like his stance, based on some of the insiders, is, show me that there's a plan being played out and I'll stay. But to me, the plan swings wildly based on your willingness to stay. Like, are we building something with you or without you? Because those are very different paths. And to me, that puts the Leafs in a tough spot here. I would rather, if you're leaving, we are fully rebuilding. And I don't want to start down a path to impress you, that you turn around in 3 months and go, no, not what I'm looking for, and then bolt. You'd almost prefer, I don't know if Mats Sundin or John Chayka have the leverage or whatever to do this, and just, no, we need an answer here, man. Like, what's happening? Because I'm not going to start trying to find you wingers and 28-year-old defensemen to come in here to play with you if it's not going to meet your standard and you're going to leave. I'd rather just start the rebuild now. It's a weird spot they're in.
Well, I think part of the thing that makes it maybe a bit simpler is that outside of this first overall pick, and I really don't expect them to trade the first overall pick for veteran talent. That would be a heck of an all-in push, and you'd have to be pretty sure Matthews is sticking around and pretty sure he feels good about, I don't know, honestly, who the coach is and that he can bounce back and all that jazz, and I just don't think it's advisable. But you're not going to be trading futures, really, for veterans. You'll be going out and signing people potentially. You'll be, working at maybe moving some veterans out, things like that, maybe taking on some bad money if you think the talent is still there. So it's only a disaster if Matthews says, okay, let's do this, let's compete, and then you trade, a bunch of draft picks and prospects for veteran guys, and then you discover this is all a train wreck and now we have to dismantle it. Really what they'd be doing is using money realistically, and maybe using what they, their ability to assess players to find value on the outside fringes. So when you're doing that, when you're bringing people that way, if for whatever reason Matthews wants to abandon ship, I'm not saying that's a good outcome, you can then ship those players out if you need to do a rebuild. And that, I guess, if those players are disasters and end up as anchor contracts, then that's an issue, but that's a different type of problem. You just haven't assessed the players correctly if that's where it comes down to. So I don't think it's that much of a problem to just try and be competitive around Matthews right now, do the best you can, and have the capacity to switch gears if you have to. Because when it comes to Matthews and trading him, you're not getting value for Matthews because, and it's complicated by the no move clause, and he'd only go to certain teams, and that makes it harder to get good return. But the value in trading Matthews theoretically is that he's an incredibly rare player. That's why teams want him. They don't want him because he's got 2 years of team control. Like, that's not the appeal there. So if you end up pivoting away from a Matthews related plan and he only has 1.5 years of control or a single year of control when you make that move, whoever signs him, whoever gets him in a trade is going to need to extend him a big contract anyway. And so it's less about the timing of that. Whereas in baseball, for instance, the way players are valued is so tied to how many years of control they have. Yeah. It's a little bit different in this. I just think you can forge ahead with Matthews, and then if you need to pivot at that point, you pivot, and you won't have sunk tons of draft picks or young players into the project.
What did you make of that piece on Monday from Chris Johnston? I'll be honest with you, man. For me, and it was sort of antagonistically titled, but I didn't think there was any crazy new information in the piece that, I'm not sure I'll be back in September. To me, that was very clearly, hey, you firing this coach or not? Because we had seen at that press conference, and maybe the piece came out Tuesday morning, not Monday morning, I can't recall. But, John Chayka said what I would fully expect a new GM to say. I'm going to talk to him. I'm going to see if our visions align for these things. I don't think almost anyone on that roster, but certainly not Austin Matthews and certainly not William Nylander, want to play for Craig Berube again. And to me, that's exactly the only thing I read into that piece was fire the coach and then come talk to me or don't. Am I oversimplifying that?
I think it's a fair interpretation. With Matthews, there's always some level of us interpreting because he doesn't necessarily say the most. And when he opens his mouth, it tends to be somewhat ambiguous or leaves room for ambiguity at least. If this front office doesn't get rid of Craig Berube, that will be a massive black mark. Mm-hmm. Like, what are you trying to do if you're keeping this? Like, the job
to me, it comes all the way back
season,
around to Pelly keeping his fingers in the pie. We know he likes Berube. It's a financial thing as well. Like, to me, this is litmus test number one for this front office. If you think you're an analytically driven front office and you look at everything that happened here this year and then decide I'm keeping this coach, massive red flag, man.
100%. Like everything I said earlier in this podcast, trying to present at least a devil's advocate case for what they might have seen in this front office alignment and what they've done with this hiring, I'd be willing to throw a lot of that out the window if they're not willing to get rid of the coach. The coach cost them a lot this season. They cost them points this season. There's not much evidence that the players have a desire to play for this coach. And that is one of the things you can improve on without, having tons of prospects or picks or
just
capital.
Money.
Just get a functional coach. You know, they talked about latent. I think it was Chayka talking about latent upside in the team. Mm-hmm. A big aspect of that latent upside has to be a change behind the bench. It just has to be.
Yeah. You are on the Blue Jays Happy Hour podcast, the Maple Leaf Hot Stove podcast. You're writing on baseball for Sportsnet, man. What's coming up? What can we expect out of Nick Ashbourne here over the next little while?
You'll see, a Maple Leafs Hot Stove podcast on all the stuff that's going on. We tend to run pretty extensive these days. I would be thinking it's going to be an hour-plus show for all these shenanigans. Blue Jays Happy Hour coming out every week. There'll be one on Thursday. Have a piece at Sportsnet on Thursday about the Jays lineup and how important Addison Barger is to it. And final plug is I will be doing the Blue Jays pregame show and Jays talk on Saturday. So you can tune in for that. I think it's Barbie Day at the ballpark. Okay. So there'll be a lot of energy in the park.
For sure. And that Blue Jays Happy Hour podcast also has a Patreon page we'll link to in the show notes. Lots of really fun bonus content there as well that I enjoy all the time. So, Nick, I appreciate this, man. I know I keep you a long time whenever I rope you into doing this. The 19 people who said it was a bad idea were clearly mistaken. Thanks for doing this, man.
No problem. Thanks for having me on.
There goes our buddy Nick Ashbourne. Like I said, we'll link to some of his work in the show notes at tallcanaudio.com or wherever you're hearing me right now. To the Blue Jays Happy Hour podcast, the Maple Leaf Hot Stove podcast, and some of his work at sportsnet.ca. A really thoughtful guy. I always enjoy speaking to him. So thanks to him once more for that. Thanks to you for checking out this edition of the Tall Can Audio Podcast. Don't forget, Steve Bunda will be here in studio on Friday morning to talk some CFL, to talk some Stanley Cup playoffs, and we'll see whatever else is noteworthy at the time. But until then, my name is Matt Robinson. Thanks so much for listening. We'll see you Friday morning.